Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Wednesday. That makes it April 13th around here, bright and early in the morning. Doug Pagitt in Minneapolis, where it's just after 10 a.m. Dan Deitrich there in South Bend, Indiana. Sure, it's early, still morning, 11. But
it's early for me, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Early for the musician's heart. But Andre Henry, you're up even earlier because it's 8 a.m. out there in LA where you are, and really glad to have you there. So those of you that are following along in the live stream, tell us where you are, what time it is, and where you find yourself. And in a lot of ways, what time is it is some of the conversation we're going to be having today. There's a question for us about, is it time to wake up to some issues? Many things you're going to find familiar to this podcast. Here we ask questions about how can we be engaged in the common good, especially those people who find themselves in a change moment from their own background, maybe from their own history, maybe people who found themselves in one political, religious identity and now are trying to find a new place and a new way to be. And one of the most important parts of that journey is to find others that are along the pathway with you. And so, Andre, so glad to have you here. Andre is a musician. He's an author, an activist. We'll get into all of that. But for now, we'll just say good morning. Nice to have you. Thanks for chatting with us today.
It's such a pleasure to be here with you guys.
And you got your bed right there behind you. I love it. Yeah. You snuck a little bed. Hey, so you've written this book called "All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep." I'm a big fan of books. I've written them myself. I've had to be in title meetings with publishers. Yes. Titles are sometimes a thing that the author gets to own. Sometimes they're something that somebody else does. Yeah. Before we get into the content of the book and why you wrote it, tell us about this title, "All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep." Where does that come from?
Sure. So the book came from an open letter that I wrote to a lot of white friends that I once considered close, some I even considered family. And they'd been online saying things like, oh, Andre's a racist. Andre hates white people. Because by then, for years, I had been writing songs and articles and making videos and all this other kind of stuff to raise awareness about systemic racism, especially in the case of police brutality, that we were watching in the heyday of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I decided, it's not fair for people to make that accusation without real proof, without a receipt. Where did I say that? Where did I show me the tweet, show me the text message, show me the blog? And so I decided that I would write them a receipt of my love. And so I wrote an open letter to them called "To All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep." And that blog went viral. And next thing you know, a literary agent had reached out to me and felt that there was a book in there. And you know how it goes from there.
Sure. Yeah, that's how it should go. That's great, right? You raise your voice a little, and then there's people who invite you to say some more, and to keep saying it. Is that phrase, like when you used it in the open letter, was it, hey, I wanted to keep you white friends, and I wanted to bring you on this journey with me, but I tried to keep you and I couldn't? Yeah. Or is it, I just can't keep you all around anymore? Like there's something that I have to shape shift in order to maintain this friendship that I can't keep anymore. I've wondered as I looked at the title, which maybe.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, there definitely was. And in the book, you see this in the early chapters, me trying to explain things to my white friends and trying to help them understand what my life is like as a Black person in America or in this anti-Black world. And in that way, I was trying to keep them. But their responses, their refusal to listen and their refusal to be open just made it untenable, because I was determined, and I am determined now, but at the time I was determined to figure out, how can I participate more actively and more strategically in the struggle for Black freedom in this world? And there's just no way for me to do that, with people who are telling me things like racism isn't real, or it's hateful to do that, or Christians shouldn't be doing that, or, all those kinds of things.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about, growing up with a lot of these white friends in white church spaces. And then this disconnect starts to grow when you start to talk about things like Ferguson and Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, you talk about how politely you're engaging with your white friends, and there's still this rejection.
Yeah.
But then you go on to talk about the need to feel okay with being angry.
Oh, yeah.
And you describe that this isn't a new phenomenon. It's almost like a generational gaslighting of Black Americans,
Yeah.
where rage and anger has always been suppressed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So the concept of racial gaslighting is a big theme in the book, and basically one of those tactics of gaslighting is denial. Literally, you're saying there's a problem, and the offender or the folks who are supporting, that situation say, "Oh no, there's no problem." It's basically a argument, right?
Yeah.
Nice.
And one of those tactics is also getting Black people to suppress our anger, because the whole point is to say that or the whole point of gaslighting is for the gaslighter to get the target to accept the gaslighter's version of the story, accept the gaslighter's version of reality. And so if your body is telling you that something's not right here, which our bodies are very good at, our bodies have a technology to tell us that, and in fact, the way that the body knows and communicates things is much faster than the executive part of our brain that gets to rationalize things, which is exactly where the oppressive system wants to keep things. Is like, because we can rationalize all kinds of things, right? And we can reframe all kinds of things. We can reframe stories. Sociologist Brian Martin talks about how one of the premier tactics of oppressors is to reframe things, right? So Black rage is the body's way of saying, this is not right. I should not be treated this way. I deserve better than this. Things ought not to be this way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a dangerous kind of knowing in our bodies to the people who want to keep things the way that they are, right? And so they say, no, you have no reason to be angry. Or at its worst, basically fix your face,
Yeah.
fix your face or else, right? And so I argue in the book that Black anger is legitimate for those reasons that I said, that it is the body's way of telling us that something is not right, and we need that in order for us to lean into our struggle for freedom, because the fact that we do feel that says, okay, your body's working, right? That's a healthy response that you're having, right?
Yeah.
And also on the other side of that is what many call our vision of tomorrow. If your body is telling you things ought not to be this way, that means that you probably have some idea of how things ought to be. And that's one of those important things that we need in order to pursue social progress, because we need to be, how do we know what we're pursuing? How do we know what we're fighting for if we don't have a vision of how things ought to be?
Yeah.
I think it's powerful that you're framing these this call and these ideas in memoir fashion, like in your own story.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of reasons, I think it's helpful. We just don't know each other's stories. It also, connects with people in a really different way. Can you tell us a bit more of the story? And in the description of the book, it says that I'm going to read the quote from the description. When the rallying cry "Black Lives Matter" was heard across the world in 2013, Andre Henry was one of the millions for whom the movement caused a political awakening and a rupture in some of his closest relationships with white people. Can you talk a bit about that? Like how you were thinking about many of these same issues, what happened in 2013, kind of what was going on in you and with you and in your own social setting and in society as a whole?
For sure. And I think this is a great question, because I think that, well, I don't think I know, like sometimes people read, the things that I have to say about the scope of the problem that we're in and what it will take to solve it, and they go, man, you sound so extreme, and it's like, you think that I was born, like I came out of the womb with my fist in the air, but I really was a very patriotic kid. I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where the legacy of the Confederacy is very strong, but no one wants to talk about it. And so, I received the same miseducation about race and racism that anybody else would growing up, where lost cause ideology is so strong, right? So I had this sense that, like anybody else, America is the greatest nation in the world. It's a place where people get what they deserve, a land of opportunity, a paragon of democracy, leader of the free world, all that stuff. Um, and at the same time, my I lived next to a man who claimed to be a part of the Ku Klux Klan, who pulled a gun on my brother for walking our dog through the neighborhood, and he was the
Mm.
pastor of the church at the top of the road.
Yeah.
So I knew that racism still existed,
Mm-hmm.
but I thought that was racism, right? Like my next door neighbor. And at the same time, my body would tell me, I would notice that,
Hmm.
okay, and sometimes teachers seem to be a little bit harsher with black kids. And, when we walk into the grocery store or the hair or the beauty supply, the store clerks, kind of follow us around a little bit, or the police seem a bit more suspicious of us. I would notice those things, and then some white adult would tell me, don't play the race card. Racism is such a serious charge, da da da, so on
Mhm.
and so forth. So for a long time, there was kind of this cognitive dissonance around these things, where it was like, on the one hand, I know that racism is a problem. When the thing happened with Trayvon Martin, there was something in my body that said, I know that something like that is more likely to happen to me,
Huh. Mhm.
and at the same time, always trying to give America the benefit of the doubt. Well, as Trayvon turned to Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Rikia Boyd, Corinne Gaines, Tatiana Jefferson, and so on and so forth. Holding that cognitive dissonance just
Mhm.
became impossible, you know, because as well as weighing that against my own experiences, of racial profiling that I experienced after I left Stone Mountain in college, um, anything from being like accused of stealing my own bike at college because the security guard said I don't, quote, look like a student,
Oh, come on.
or up to the many times that I've been stopped and searched by police officers who were just sure that I must have drugs and weapons on me. It's not even a question. They're like, not are you carrying any, but not are you carrying any, but where are they? you
Wow.
know.
Mm-hmm.
So weighing those things against mine and the witness of history, the witness of my neighbors, there was just no way to hold those things together anymore. So the watershed moment was Philando Castile's when Philando Castile, we watched Philando Castile bleed to death on Facebook Live. I had already begun speaking up a little bit, with people in my immediate social circle,
Mhm.
some of the people I write about in the book, subtly posting some things on Facebook or social media. But that day that I watched Philando Castile bleed to death, the day after I watched Alton Sterling get shot, by local police officers in Louisiana, I said, enough is enough. I'm tired of sitting here and feeling helpless and powerless. And I have to figure out some way to invest my body in the struggle for Black freedom.
Yeah. And
My
one
my
of the
wife is a big
things, oh, go ahead.
my wife's a big fan of a book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
Familiar with that? It's about
Yes.
generational trauma and so on. Is that are you familiar with that book or with that
I
idea and
am.
how trauma, because it's one of the ways to understand our society and the multiple traumas that inflict different people and different groups of people really
Mhm.
does start to explain a lot of our social struggles that we otherwise have difficulty wrapping our
Mhm.
heads around. Thoughts about
Yes.
that?
Yeah, I have been reading The Body Keeps the Score, actually. And I've not finished it, but I do think that there is a lot of, I obviously the author knows what they're talking about, but I see the I see the resonance in what we're talking about here
Yeah.
with, systemic racism, like, and so much of this does have to do with embodiment,
Yeah.
and paying attention to that. And I think that a huge part of the or a weapon of this this racist, domination is to keep us out of touch, with our bodies, especially Black bodies, right? So there is this kind of, I noticed a refusal of the white friends that I couldn't keep to really take in the violence that was inflicted on Philando Castile, on Michael Brown.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it didn't really sink in to them, you know, like the trauma inflicted not just on Michael Brown, but on that community, you know, in Ferguson, on his family, on his friends, on his neighbors. So there's one point in the book where I'm writing about Corinne Gaines, who was killed by Baltimore police. And I didn't know this until I was retelling her story, but she actually knew Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray was her neighbor, you know? And it really made me think about, wow, like her seeing her neighbor killed by the police was something that radicalized her even more, you know, because she grew up in a police family. And it also ties back into the question about rage, and some of the opposition that I encountered around this was that a lot of white people that I was in conversation with then, I don't really talk with white people like this anymore, you know, folks who were just trying to gaslight me about racism. But at the time, they didn't seem to understand, or maybe they weren't trying to understand, that when we see uprisings like Ferguson, when we see uprisings like the ones in Baltimore and all that kind of stuff, that it is a response to the ongoing trauma of colonization and white supremacist domination.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you had this sort of awakening, this apocalypse, you decided you had to do something. And one of the things you did was haul around 100-pound rock covered in names. This kind of act of performance art protest. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. That was a few weeks after Philando's death, and I had resolved I would invest my body in some way in the struggle for Black freedom. And in a few weeks, I had like a vision, you could say, you know, of me doing this, like me with a large white boulder that had, you know, all of these racial injustices written all over it, and the names of folks killed in police encounters and all that kind of stuff. And I felt like I was supposed to do it. I felt compelled to do it. And so I did. I asked my friends on Facebook if they knew where I could find a boulder, you know, and folks, you know, of course, folks didn't take it seriously at first. So, you know, I get people, you know, making rock jokes, and then others who are like, you could go out to the desert or you could go out to the beach. And I'm like, both of those things are far away. But there's a guy, a classmate of mine from Fuller Seminary that lived 10 minutes away, and he was like, how big? And so I knew that meant that he had at least one.
A variety,
right?
apparently. Yeah.
Right. He did have a variety. He had in some ways, it was kind of like he had a collection of boulders that had been strewn across his yard, basically. And I chose the heaviest one that I could carry. And I painted it white, and they helped me get a cart for it because it was so heavy from Home Depot. And I wrote everything that I could remember from that vision and that I knew of on that boulder. And I took it everywhere with me for several months, about 6 months total. About 4 months I took it everywhere with me. And then for about the last 2 months, I just took it to church, because I was playing the piano at several different churches, and someone had really challenged me to think through who really needs to hear this. And at the time, I felt like it was churches. It just seemed like, I mean, Christianity is so implicated in this global system of racism.
Yeah.
And at the same time has a book that says that the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. So I figured that would be the place to take it.
What was the reaction when you rolled this boulder into churches where you're leading worship at these churches, right? Like,
yeah, I was leading worship. I was on stage, so I'd lug this boulder on stage at church and play the piano. And I also I had another vision, and where I was dressed for a funeral, and all over my suit jacket was written the names of people who had been suffered police brutality, and so I did that too. And on the back was "Stop Killing Us." So like I lugged this boulder onto stage, dressed for a funeral, with the names and hashtags of people who had been killed by the police all over my body. And surprisingly, not many people said anything. Like it was
Yeah.
very rare that anyone said anything to me at
Just
church.
ignored it.
Yeah, pretty much, pretty much. Except for one comment I wrote about in the book. Someone said something real insensitive, like read the back of my jacket that says "Stop Killing Us" and said, "Oh, stop killing us with laughter, huh?" And I didn't understand the response, but he did come back and apologize later. I think somebody might have said to him, like, somebody might have, "Hey man,
Like, hey, that might not have been cool.
yeah,
Well,
but that was it.
that kind of thing it fits in this long tradition of cultural change and spiritual, political, societal protest. And you can think of the stories that we read from the Hebrew narratives of the prophets laying on a side for a year, or people calling things, or living in a desert, or eating certain foods, shaving their heads. Like these kinds of things are alternatives to alternative ways to call people to change, short of violent revolution. And there's been a big debate around this issue in the United States, that really goes back to before the founding of this country, about what do we do about the versions of enslavement in the United States. And one option has been armed rebel uprisings.
Yes.
Creating alternative communities for Black Americans to live in. To integrate into society with societal change. Like there's been a range of choices, and they range from violent to nonviolent, and they range from don't talk about it to talk about it all the time. Like we've just tried every version of all this stuff, right? It seems like. And so before we get into is anything actually going to work? You've chosen a particular path, which we talked about some before we came on, of being in this tradition of deep activism, disruptive activism from a nonviolent tradition side. Can you talk about that? Because this thing you're describing, right, it's whimsical, but it's meant to make people say something about it. Like they're not supposed to just sit there or have to awkwardly crack a joke. It's supposed to call for people to do something.
Yeah, so when I started, so that day that I said I have to invest my body in the struggle for Black freedom, I did not really know a whole lot about how societies change. I didn't know a whole lot about social progress, and I didn't know where to start. I had heard people say all the time that there are only two ways that societies change, and that is either economic disruption or through bloodshed. And that was all I had heard people say that a lot. And so that's where I was sitting that day, that summer 2016. And I decided that day that I needed to learn about the civil rights movement because, there are no more whites only signs up in restaurants and over water fountains and bathrooms and stuff like that. So clearly they were onto something. And so I've embarked on that journey, and I've read so many books about nonviolent struggle and civil resistance. And I started with like Thoreau with civil disobedience, and then I started meeting like living revolutionaries, like Serja Popovich and Bob Helvey and others who have actually helped in other struggles around the world. I actually, I remember, I just kind of bothered them until they realized that I am one of their students, and now we're friends. And so I'll say that I looked into that for the reasons that I said. It seemed like it worked. And what I found in studying nonviolent civil resistance is that there is this misconception that violence is the strongest force in the world, right? And there's nothing that can really compete with it. And I'm never going to say that violence never accomplishes anything, because we live in America and this nation was accomplished by a level of violence that is literally unfathomable. You
Mm-hmm.
know, the millions of indigenous people and African indigenous people that have been killed in order to bring us into this society is just, we'll never be able to wrap our brains around it. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but I was glad to find that violence is not the only option, because I mean, not only just because I would make a terrible soldier in a revolutionary conflict, um, but also the means to launch that kind of rebellion, I just don't think is available to Black people. You know, I don't think it's realistic. But what I found was, for example, the study from Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Steffen that studied 627 conflict situations between 1900 and 2019. And in that study, they found that the nonviolent movements were twice.
Oh, lost you there.
Yeah,
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
we get you.
I heard it pop as soon as I was about to say it. So what they found was that the nonviolent movements were twice as successful as armed struggles. Armed struggles had about a 25% chance of winning, and nonviolent struggles had about a 50% chance of winning. They also found that it only took about, they also found that consistently, just 3.5% of any of those populations engaged in sustained, active, nonviolent struggle was enough to topple dictatorships, to end totalitarian rule, to break down oppressive laws, and all that kind of stuff. Reading Gene Sharp's material, who, if you've never heard of Gene Sharp out there, Gene Sharp is a giant in the study of nonviolent struggle and scholarship. I mean, he's just as important as Gandhi. And Gene Sharp, in his book From Dictatorship to Democracy, was writing about how some of these regimes would fall in as little as 2 weeks through nonviolent struggle. Now that's not all of them. I mean, oftentimes, it takes years, but I mean, that is also possible. And these things just made me so hopeful, and helped me to wrap my brain around some of the nuts and bolts of how the thing works. And that's what makes me such a huge believer in nonviolent civil resistance, and why I'm kind of banging the drum for it.
So one of the big questions, facing our age is what would it look like for a revolution of inclusion and love and full participation? What would that look like in our society? There was a real sense among a lot of people, especially among white political liberals, that the middle 2000s, especially the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and other societal shifts and changes, were signposts that told us that we had traveled someplace new, that we were in some new social territory.
Yeah.
And it's easy to wrap it up in people saying, well, we live in a post-racial America, and then people just mocking that. But there was a sense that, okay, we've marked something, we've moved along. Some people feel like, boy, the goalposts or the marking posts keep getting moved, right? Like, well, what's next? And I hear this a lot from people who feel worn out, especially white Americans, who feel worn out by, like, we're still talking about all this race stuff. They phrase it like that, and they're like, I mean, what more do you want? How far, right? This kind of thing. But it's a real question, right? People are like, okay, what's it going to look like when you get up in the morning and you think, I've got a vision for, a future. You have your own dream. Right. Hopefully we don't tag ourselves, to 50-year-old dreams only, right? What is your dream? What does that start to look like in your lifetime, as you've now invested your time and energy in this? And now you're one of the people that others gather around, as you were gathering around, activists and nonviolent people. What do you see?
Yeah. Up. Did it do it again? I don't know what's going on with my microphones.
Got a
Can you
little
hear?
quieter.
Okay, let's see. I don't know what's going on. Check 1, 2. Hello.
I mean, it is a serious mic. For those who can't see it, it is Jupiter of a microphone. It's fantastic. It is.
Yeah, for a while I couldn't tell if it was very close to the camera and just looked larger
Just
than.
gigantic. Yeah,
No, it's big.
it is big. Well, I'm just going to yammer on. Oh, look at that. I want to see that side of your microphone too. All right. This is getting more interesting by the minute there, Andre. And I think this is a real notion. Now, look, I heard a phrase from a friend in activist work that said, there's no alarm clock loud enough to wake someone from a fake sleep. And the idea that like people have to wake up to certain ideas and alarms are going off and it's morning in America again, we should be waking up to some of these issues. They're like, yeah, but a lot of people are fake sleeping. And so the issue isn't ring the bell louder. They don't want to get up or they don't want to even show that they're going to wake up. So granting that, and I think you have a lot of comments about that actually in the book. But for the people who really don't get it or know or imagine what a future would look like.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, do you think there's enough of those people to fuss with? And what kind of future can you imagine?
One of my core values is that the vision of tomorrow has to come from the people. And so something that I imagine and an idea I kind of toyed around with is that the American people have to elect themselves as president. And what that would look like, I think, begins with us literally having conversations in our communities about what we imagine our communities would be like if we were successful, in launching this anti-racist revolution, right? But I can dream, I dream of the end of a police state in America. I dream of, a society that is based on the values of everyone has their needs met and everyone is worthy of having their needs met, right? We all have a right to live and to a certain quality of life. So there's no withholding resources and all that kind of stuff because we deem someone unworthy because they're poor. Which first off, how did they get that way? It's a whole other conversation, right? Or because of race or because of religion or sexual orientation, all that kind of stuff, right? I dream of a world where we rehabilitate people, instead of using these punitive measures, to address crime, and where the root causes of what we call crime are at least minimized, if not non-existent, right? Because we know that people resort to quote unquote criminal behavior because they don't have their needs met. Right. So this is like the racial wealth gap is closed, right? Healthcare is accessible to everyone. Education is accessible to everyone. So I mean, those are the things that come to mind for me when I think about these things. But one more thing I'd add to that is Alex Vitale's book, The End of Policing. He goes through all of the things that we claim that police do, or that they keep us safe from, and why those things are not true. Breaks down all those myths. But he has a phrase in there that has really stuck with me. And he talks about how the alternative to the police state, the alternative to policing is actually a robust democracy.
Interesting. Yeah. Talk more about that imagination. Is that because in a robust democracy, people carry responsibility for one another differently, and they don't need to pretend the reason they're safe is because there's some force out there keeping them safe from dangerous people?
Well, yeah, it's about us having strong communities where everyone has their needs met, right? So if someone doesn't have a house, right? They're living on the street. It's harder for them to find a job, right? Because first off, their primary question is, where do I sleep tonight? Right. So that's the thing. That's the mission that they're on every day. Where do I sleep? How do I eat? All those kinds of things. Right. And if they're in that point of desperation, they might resort to desperate measures. Right. Someone might steal food from a grocery store. Someone might break into someone's home to get something that they can sell or something like that. Right. And what's keeping us from providing homes for these people or providing good jobs for these people? Oftentimes it's just culture. It's like stories that we tell, right? In Finland, they've cut the unhoused population in half by, wait for it, giving people homes. Right? Giving people
How'd they
a
do it?
place. Yeah, how'd they do it? Which actually reminds me of a quote from Dr. King in one of his speeches where he said, "Listen, we found out that the best way to deal with poverty is the most direct way, which is give people money." Right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of solution, right? So they cut the unhoused population in half by giving people money. By giving people homes. And what they found is that these people do not just lie around in these free housings and all that kind of stuff. That stability enables them to find a job, right? And that lowers the recidivism rate, right? Because people are able to get stable. In America, that kind of solution is unthinkable to some people because we operate under this narrative that if you're unhoused or if you're poor, it's your fault.
Yeah.
You did something wrong, or you have some kind of bad habit that's keeping you from winning. What you need to do is pull yourself up by the bootstraps and, play this game. Well, we know that actually the game is rigged. It's like Brian Stevenson says, the opposite of poverty is justice, not wealth, right? When we talk about what a robust democracy looks like, I think that it is things like that where we say, I think that my understanding of democracy is that we all have certain rights, right? And there's this level of equality that we're looking for, and we're trying to make sure that everyone has access to those rights. Well, having a home should be a human right. A place to live should be a human right. Having a living wage, a livable wage should be a human right. All those kinds of things. So I think that that's what I mean.
Yeah.
And those things mitigate those things. So what we're doing instead is we're punishing people for being poor, letting the police abuse them, having the police remove, I'm going to stay on the unhoused topic for now. Because it's also a racial justice issue, right? Like the 8% of LA is Black, 40% of the unhoused population in LA is Black. It's crazy disproportionate, right? And what's happening is instead of making sure that these people have the human right of a place to live, the human right of shelter, like the police are just moving, and moving is a nice term. They're forcing unhoused people from different areas of the city. Like I live in Inglewood, where the Super Bowl is. We have this huge new SoFi Stadium, and you should just see the way that they basically just swept unhoused people out of the area for the Super Bowl,
and destroy their belongings and tents just what little they have, they take away. And
the level of cruelty that is leveled against these people is crazy. It's immoral, And so basically what we're saying is like, we keep on using violence, state violence, systemic violence, police violence to answer questions that are actually just human rights issues, and we would actually lessen the so-called need for police if we would just actually be true to the values that this country says that it was founded on.
It's this, I'll just echo some of that for a moment. There's this thing where people say, look, if you just give people money and give them what they need to live on, they're just going to be lazy. Now, look, if that were true, and for the people who hold to that view, we should go to every Ivy League school and make sure that all those kids living off their parents' money while they sit for 4 years, or, don't just become lazy. No, there it's like, hey, if you get money for 4 years and you get to, be treated like royalty, then you're going to be able to make something of yourself. In fact, some people with so much money will cheat to get their kids into a situation where they don't have to work and can be funded at an Ivy League education for 4 years. Or we'd run around for all the
Right.
trust fund kids and say the most dangerous people in America are these trust fund kids that don't have to work because they're just going to be lazy and are going to be, some sort of burden. We know that's not true. We don't say that to
Right,
grandma
exactly.
when she retires. We don't say, hey, grandma, you stopped working and now you're living off Social Security payments. Where's your W-2, grandma? Where are you? We need you to start chipping in. Let's check
Right.
grandma's bank account and make sure she's producing. No, we don't
We
say
also
it to
don't do
children.
that with we also don't do that with billionaires or trillionaires, right?
Right.
We
No,
don't.
we don't do it with any of these people.
Yeah. Like
We-
these people don't clock in for work at 9 a.m.
No. And so the idea that, like, if you don't have what people need are the resources to live on. I like this idea that we can imagine a world where everyone has enough and no one needs to be afraid. Like, that's not
Right.
overly complicated. It's hard to get to, but both fear,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of reasons people have fears. So
Yeah.
this economic narrative, it's always been tied to these racial issues, especially the racial issues of Black people in America. Like, look, race is not only about Black people. Of course, there's racism, there's bigotry, there's culturalism, there's colorism, there's Asian bias, there's all these things. But I think that in America, our country and a lot of our citizenry has a particularly uncomfortable relationship with Black bodies.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
think we know, and I think we fear. James Baldwin has this very famous quote: "To be Black and conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage."
Yes.
Well,
Yeah, you quote that in the book.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And every, especially Black man I know, feels that, and that's what scares white America, right?
Yeah.
They're like, we've created a situation where we know we've done harm, and now is there going to be some kind of payback? And this feels like what's at the root of the money distribution or education or anything. Like, what happens? Is there going to be some payback at some point? Like, I hear white Americans talk about this, especially in the South, where they're like, well, what do you think the solution to this is going to be? They're going to come take our land. They're going to come take our farms. They, all this kind of language.
Right.
So
Right.
do you think, so yes, society, it is societal. It's also these fears that Americans have across the board. Everyone feels afraid of one another and each other. And then we tell ourselves a story that the reason bad things aren't happening is because the police are keeping bad things from happening.
Yes.
That's just not the case. There's not enough police to stop bad things from happening, right? I mean, just do the math. Of course not.
Right. Right.
And it's not just, our fears are not rooted in reality. Do you have thoughts about that particular Black experience that the book chases out, or that you're willing to share about today?
About white people's fear of, like, racial retribution.
Yeah, or just the particular experiences of the particulars of Black experience in America and how that impacts our narrative of just fear that exists.
Yeah, I do write about this a bit, because that idea that there's going to be some kind of Black retribution for this. I mean, it's an old lie. It was partly, I believe that people were saying that around emancipation, like, this rumor emerged that, now if you set these captives free, like, they're going to come and give us our just desserts. And all I would say to that is, like, yo, like, if that was gonna happen, we've had enough time, like most black people I know don't have any desire, to, like, wage some sort of race war, right? In fact, I think that I'm pretty sure that in like the intro or the first chapter, I talk about how, like, white people in America are always talking about some looming race war as though it didn't begin as soon as, white people started ferrying African people across the Atlantic Ocean as cargo.
Yeah.
As though it hadn't already begun when they started genociding indigenous people. The race war has already started centuries ago. Black people are on the defensive.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of outlandish, this irrational fear that
So
that so many people have of us, and it's based on anti-blackness. So it's like, when we talk about, when, as you were saying that, it just made me think of the "We Can All Be White" chapter, where I do talk about how, anti-blackness exists in black communities, anti-blackness exists in non-black communities of color, non anti-blackness exists in white communities, obviously, right? And so it's a problem across the board for us, where it's not just white people, it's not just white people's misconceptions or anti-blackness that we have to worry about. It's also, when you walk in, it's also in Asian American communities, it's also in Middle Eastern communities, it's also in Jewish communities, where, because everyone under this colonial system feels the pressure to become as white as they can, and blackness is juxtaposed as the non-human, the polar opposite of whiteness. Everyone's trying to disassociate from blackness, and one of the primary ways that people can do that is by participating in anti-black violence in some way, whether that's microaggressions or stereotypes or racial slurs or whatever, or up to, some of the most violent, which is what we see, like with police violence. So I won't say too much more about this, but it's just so, like, it's at the point where it's like, I'm not even surprised anymore. Like, when some video of someone like Justin Bieber comes out and he's like singing "There's Gonna Be One Less Lonely N-Word," which I found out the other day is a real thing. And I
oh
was like,
gosh.
yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, of course, you're always going to find out that someone somewhere down the line probably did participate in something that is totally racist, because it's how our society is structured.
And wrapped up in all of this is Christianity, specifically white evangelicalism in America. And you have this
Absolutely.
chapter, and I've got my mug here. I don't know if you can see it. Break Up with White Jesus mug. But you have a whole chapter devoted to this.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a cheeky slogan, and it's been a great conversation starter. Like, I have this sitting on my
Yeah.
desk, and people are like, "What's that?" And then, you can launch into a conversation from it. But
Yes.
unpack that phrase for us a little bit, and why it's so important to break up with white Jesus.
Yeah, so I write about how white Jesus was one of the white friends that I couldn't keep, because I realized, I realized as I kept arguing with white Christians about this, that they would say things to me like, "Well, racism is not a priority to God," or "Racial justice is not a part of the gospel," or "Jesus didn't lead any protests against Rome; he let them kill him." These are all real
Yeah.
things, that people would
Wow.
say to me. And it occurred to me one day, that these same white people, they would assume that if they had a sick child, they could pray for that sick child, and Jesus would care. Those same white people would pull up into the parking lot at Walmart and ask God for a good parking space, and they believe that Jesus would care, right? But you're telling me that Jesus doesn't care when we watch someone like Philando Castile bleed to death on Facebook Live in front of his girlfriend and their 4-year-old daughter. Well, I can only assume from that you believe that Jesus is a larger version of yourselves. Jesus must be a white, middle class, male American concerned with white, middle class, male American things. And I realized that's not a new idea, right? Like, it's why one of the earliest slave ships was actually named Jesus, Jesus of Lubeck.
Wow.
They put Jesus' name on the side of one of these slave ships because the colonizers also began to depict Jesus or God as the sponsor of the slave trade. During Jim Crow, we see all these paintings of white Jesus. And so I wrote about, the idea that Jesus is white is to suggest that Jesus is committed to the project of building, expanding, preserving white power, right? And it reminds me of Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, where he talks about, the concept of God being free, right? Because um, in that oppressive system, in his interpretation of the situation in Egypt in the Exodus narrative, is that the gods are not free to side with the marginalized, that the gods are beholden to the state. And I feel like I saw something similar, with what white Christians were telling me, is that Jesus is not free to love Black people or to aid Black people, to support Black people in our struggle for freedom. No, Jesus is beholden to whiteness. Jesus is our guy.
Mm.
Oh, mhm.
And I remember that morning where I realized that, and I said, like, I'm not going to church today if we're just worshiping some white guy in the sky who doesn't care about Black people. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also that morning I thought about, the narratives that are actually, I think, in the biblical text, which show a God that does not like systemic oppression very much. The Exodus narrative, I think, is telling us that, and the fact that, God really waged war, on that oppressive system in order to free the Israelites.
Yeah. And that's what's so strange is to uphold white Jesus, you have to ignore so many parts of the Bible, including most of Jesus. So all these folks that are like, just read the Bible, that's all you need, it interprets itself. Like, well, seems like you're skipping some parts.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because the Bible that they gave captives on these work camps in America, they removed some of those texts. Like, they
Yeah.
took the Exodus story out of
Right.
there. They didn't want enslaved people to see this story about a God who fights against slavery. And so that tradition continues.
Yeah.
The subtitle to your book, which the title is "All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep," the subtitle is "Hope and Hard Pills to Swallow About Fighting for Black Lives." You think about hope in a particular way. Can you talk a bit about that, where hope sits for you? And
Of course. So for me, hope is more of a practice. Sometimes I compare it to a fire that we tend, right? Which means it can be started, right? It can be started and it can be maintained. Um, Gosh, what is going on? I'm so sorry. Can y'all
That's all
still
right.
hear me okay?
Yeah.
it sounds good. Yeah, it's still going.
Okay, good. So, and I discovered that because, about a year into lugging that boulder around, wearing the suit, speaking, writing, singing, all that stuff, I just got so burnt out because I thought that I had to be this very serious person all the time, because we're dealing with death. Right. And we're dealing with a nation that refuses to grieve. Right. The fact that, racism is the foundation and continues to endure. And I was in such a deep depression about it. And one of my good friends, Paul, in Florida, saw that, he's not going to last this way. And he sent me a book called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. And Rebecca Solnit's book was the beginning of me having a new understanding of hope, because she talked about how hope is dependent on uncertainty. She said that the optimist says that everything's going to be all right no matter what we do. And pessimists say everything's going to be terrible no matter what we do. And both of those people excuse themselves from action. And that was the beginning of me coming to a new understanding of hope, that it actually depends on me not really knowing how things will turn out, but understanding that history is not a story that is happening to us. It's one that we're writing together, and that we get a say. We have a chance at influencing the next chapter, or the chapter that we're in. And we know this because whenever we hear about some atrocity in the world that, some minority of bad people were able to organize and execute, we always ask, well, what was everybody else doing at that time?
Yeah, right.
What were all the normal people doing at that time? Because we understand that if they had acted differently, then that chapter of history might have looked different. So that's where that began for me. And after reading Solnit's book, I resolved to always be reading a book about hope, and to intentionally pursue, hope by reading the stories of people who have fought against oppression and won, even if they're little victories. right?
Mm.
And in doing that, it keeps me coming back to the fact that no matter how bleak things are
Mm.
or they seem, I still see right now that there is a chance that we can create some change if we can organize those people and we can do the things that people have done before.
Well, thanks for that recommendation. The book that you're referring to is called Hope in the Dark. I just looked it up here on Amazon. It rang a bell. And there's 2 books by that title, one written by someone named Craig Groeschel. That's not the one. And I would suggest people not.
No.
I know Craig. He's a friend, but that's not the one. Don't order that one. This one's by Rebecca Stone. And I clicked
Don't order
on it.
that one. That's funny.
Yeah, don't order that one. And I clicked on it, and then Amazon tells me, hey, you ordered this book on January 15th, 2017. So somehow I ordered the book, knew about it, forgot about it, and I almost went to it again, which
That's funny.
thank you, Amazon, for reminding me of what I've previously done.
That's
Because,
so funny.
I mean, I think, that subtitle are untold histories and wild possibilities. That does feel like wherever someone's going to find their hope is important. Activism is, by definition, unfinished work.
Yeah.
It's as opposed to a chore that you're going to go do, right? Where you can sort of finish it and be done. If we think it's tiring for us, imagine having to tell the stories to people 150, 230 years ago that we were still going to be having these conversations. They would have still done the work because there's no other option.
Right.
What's the other option to not do the work? So you have to stay healthy and you have to stay alive and you have to think about all the other things, and life can still be very good and you can still laugh. And I know some of our temperaments go more easily that way, but it's hard to know how to do that stuff publicly, Andre. And I think you're finding a way to do that. And I think are a guide for people and a journey mate for people on doing that. And I know that you're engaged with a lot of the other activists who write about these issues, people, especially from the Christian tradition of a similar generation and social context to yours. And people are trying to stay alive and trying to stay healthy. Do you have advice for people who are from, the white experience in America about how they should engage? Because there's a lot of white people who don't know what to do. And I don't mean the people who are like, I don't get racism. I'm talking about the people who do get it. And they're like, oh my gosh, I just don't know. Like, do I talk about it too much? Do I not talk about it enough? Can I say it with a smile? Are people not taking me seriously? Like, there's just a lot of insecurity in the world, not because people are only afraid for not good reasons. They just don't, they want to do no harm. They want to only do what's good. And that causes a giant game of freeze tag to happen and people feel real stuck. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts, for maybe the audience that are these friends you couldn't keep? There are some white friends you have kept. How do you talk to them about being a journeyer with you on this work?
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna make mistakes, and so like you just can't go for perfection, with this. But the thing that I've been saying a lot lately is because I've been thinking more about racism in its relationship to imperialism, in its relationship to colonialism. And I think that Mandela would agree with me, who is one of my favorite freedom fighters, when he talked about his time in Robben Island prison, and he said that he realized that that the prisoners, that the oppressors were also oppressed in a way. They were oppressed at least at the very least in the way of their thinking and their common sense that allowed them to participate in the apartheid system. I feel a similar way about white people. I think that colonization is not just victimized, not just dehumanized Black people through visceral, physical anti-Black violence. I think that colonization has also dehumanized white people by gutting them of empathy for Black people, by making them feel comfortable with complicity in a system of global violence, with blinding them. I shouldn't say blinding. I've people really getting on me with ableist language, but by pulling the veil over their eyes, right, about certain things, obscuring the history, right? That's gaslighting too. even though they're privileged by it, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that white people need to the look into what has been done to them through
Yeah.
colonization, right? Because I don't think that you could actually look at yourself and say, if you can look at someone, or if you need, sorry, to see more people bleed to death in order for you to feel something, that's a problem. That should bother you. That should
Yeah.
keep you up at night. You should be looking for how you can be healed so that you can experience your full humanity and truly recognize the humanity in others. And I just think that white people I don't know how you get it. I don't know how you get this, but I think that white people need to start seeing this as their problem
Mm-hmm.
and start being really committed to healing from that.
Yeah. Well, that is so well said. A lot of times people think that racism is an issue primarily facing those who are bigoted against or the system works against. And racism is an oppressor problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I'm not taking away the pain at all. I'm saying that where the problem lies, where the solution has to find itself, and that's going to mean listening. As we started the conversation, when you said people in communities that are impacted, also, they know. So
Right.
that means a kind of relational connection that's hard to get to. Mike, in the comments here, somebody named Mike commented that look, there's a chicken and an egg question here about which framed what, but fundamentally there's a human spiritual problem. I don't mean that in the religious sense, but a spirit to spirit problem,
Right.
that we know repeats over and over in society, right? And it shows up in our families. Most abuse and violence against another person in our country is done by someone who knows them.
Yes.
Is in close contact, sometimes even a family member. So proximity is not enough to prevent the kind of hatred and violence and harm. We self-harm as human beings, so we'll even hurt ourselves. Like our willingness to hurt is boundless. So we have to find some other means to not do that, especially on scale. And systemic societal bias and racism it is categorical. Like it's a crime against humanity, which is something greater than, we have to classify the levels of harm that human beings do to one another. And that one seems to have really risen above. So thank you for your good work on this. And any final comments you want to make about the book or the work you're doing or where people can find you or what you're up to next or any other?
Sure. The thing that I always do like to leave people with is, I really do believe that it doesn't have to be this way. And that's partly why I wrote this book. It's not just about, me cutting off problematic people who refuse to listen and who refuse to move. It's really about delivering insight, about building stronger movements, about building more strategic movements that can move the needle forward. Because I'm concerned, especially after the global uprising for Black lives in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the ongoing fascist counter-revolution that is emerging in response to that uprising, that people are continuing to operate on theories of change that will not work, such as all we need to do to address racism is sit down with people who have bad ideas and try to convince them of better ideas. Like that may have a role, but those coffee table conversations are not going to redistribute the billions of dollars that are put into policing instead of into community care. So that's one, the theories of change, the strategies of change that won't work. And also engaging in protest alone and thinking that if we just get millions of people in the streets chanting the same thing at the same time, then the world will change. No, we need more strategic movements, and the stakes are higher than ever, because I talked to Erica Chenoweth the other day, who is the scholar who worked on the study I mentioned earlier, and she told me that we're losing more battles around the world through nonviolent civil resistance than we're winning. And the reason why we're losing more than we're winning is not because nonviolence is inherently weaker than armed struggle, but because people don't really know the art. They don't know the craft of uprising. They don't have a large vocabulary of nonviolent tactics to employ. We don't understand strategy. We're not employing the strategies that are more disruptive, like the boycotts and the strikes that actually put economic pressure on different systems. I write about this stuff in the book, and I know that it's not easy to see that from the cover or from the title for people. But the reason why it's couched in a memoir is because I don't think that if I'd just written a book about the nuts and bolts of nonviolent civil resistance, that it would have made it to the shelf at Target. So I want for people to read this and to take it to heart. And I hope that it makes you more active. I hope that it makes you more hopeful. I hope that it gives you practical insight about how you can play a part in the struggle for Black freedom. And if you want to get in touch with me, like, go to my website. It's andrehenry.co. Every way to get in touch with me is there: social media, email list, all that kind of stuff.
Well, thank you so much. It's really great to know you and to talk with you, and free to be part of all this.
Yeah.
Thanks so
for
much.
having me. Yeah, thank you so much.
And if you head over to the website, you can get one of these mugs. So
that's very true. That's true too.
Yeah, we'll throw a link. We'll throw a link into all those places, and you can pick up all that stuff. All right, last question. Tell us about that microphone, because that thing has been a fourth character in the entire podcast.
Oh my gosh, I don't know why.
What is that little gem?
I don't know why it's acting up, but you all know I'm a singer songwriter. I'm a musician. I know people are very in this capitalist common sense. They're like, don't tell people that first. It's confusing. I'm like, well, fine, be confused. I'm a human being. I got layers. I'm a parfait. Get over it, right? So I'm a singer songwriter, and so like I basically just use my setup here for all these interviews and stuff. So what you see, I have a Neumann TLM 103 in here. It's a really good microphone, for cutting vocals and stuff. One of my favorites that I have. And around it is what is called the Chaotica eyeball, which basically acts as a sound treatment. It's like my bedroom's not treated, but when I sing into this microphone, it really deadens all of the bouncing, off of the walls that it would do. So you can't tell that I'm not in the studio when I'm recording. Yeah.
So that big thing we see there is a cover over a microphone that's on the inside and is creating a context for your sound in there. It's like a giant windscreen, or
yeah, exactly.
It's like an isolation booth, just right.
Exactly.
Well, it's
love it.
I know something to look for this afternoon, because I love that kind of stuff so much. All right, hey, I'll pick up the book, All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. It's more than you might imagine. Yes, it's memoir, but it's also, as Andre said, a call for how we can move forward, one of the pathways. And we want to applaud that the way forward is a way of love, and that way of love needs to include not harming and killing one another. And so it's just one of the things I think that we need to put on the list of demands that we have for one another and for a future of society.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
All right, we'll talk to you tomorrow.